All right, book brats, it's time for my full summary of the book, Fourth Wing. By the way, do you like this shirt? Or this cup? Or this sticker? Go to officialstephenwalker.com for all of your book brat merchandise. Anyway, back to the task at hand. Let's just start at the beginning and go from there. By the way, spoiler alert. So the book starts off with our main character, whose name is Violet. She's about 21 years old and has more sexual frustration than a three-legged buck during mating season. She's also disabled, but don't get too attached to that because it's a vague disability. We never really know what she has, and it doesn't ever really come up. Her mother's a dragon rider, and her dad is dead. But when he was alive, he was a scribe. And that's what Violet was supposed to be when she grew up because that's all she's ever known. But for some reason, her mother wants her to be a dragon rider. So the mother sends Violet, whose real name should be Violin because of how much she whines and wants to fiddle with somebody. So the mother sends Violin to this magical school that will teach you how to be a dragon rider called Dragonwarts. Unfortunately, in order to get to Dragonwarts, you have to enter and win a tightrope walking competition. So she gets to the tightrope, but along the way has befriended a couple of people, including a gentleman who I'm thinking, oh, this is a nice character. I can't wait to see where this goes. Perhaps he's a love interest. He starts walking the tightrope. Anyway, he falls off and dies. Then we meet hot dude number one, whose name is Zaddy Spearmint, and it says verbatim in the book that she thinks he's 6'4", and I'm thinking, hey, that's how tall I am. Apparently he and Violin are enemies because of their parents and their past. So Violin starts walking across this tightrope to get to Dragonwarts. It's difficult, it's windy, but she's doing good until we meet this new character whose name is Jack Harlow. He shows up, he throws somebody off the tightrope, and he looks at Violet and he goes, "What's poppin'?" And for some reason, he just wants to kill her. So he chases her down this tightrope, and eventually they get to Dragonwarts. She holds a knife up to his nads, and he walks away. Then we get to meet hot guy number two, whose name is Dane the Brain Peeker. Apparently he and Violin are old friends, and they go way back. He tries to tell her, hey, you don't belong here in Dragonwarts. You're a scribe. You belong in the tortured poets department. She's like, I know, I need to be with my typewriter. And he's like, who uses typewriters anyway? But she ends up staying and is put in this little faction, if you will, called Fourth Wing. Book title. But unfortunately, the leader of Fourth Wing is Zaddy Spearmint, her sworn enemy. And no one saw that coming. Then enter dragons. By the way, this book shifts scenes more abruptly than a foot cramp. But the scene shifts to this ceremony where a professor is telling all of the students that, hey, 60 people died out there on that tightrope, but somehow we're still a school and everything's going to be okay. Unless it's not. Then Violin goes to her first class and learns that the Death Eaters attack some area nearby. And then they go to wrestling class. It's a wrestling class. Jack Harlow shows up to wrestling class and says, hey, I don't like no whips and chains and you can't tie me down. And he snaps a guy's neck. Then Violin rolls with somebody on the mat and gets a bone broken, but Daddy Dane, the Brain Peeker, scoops her up and takes her back to his room to heal her. Then Violin's sister somehow sneaks her dead brother's journal to her. Then Violin realizes, hey, I can't really do much because I belong in the tortured poets department and I don't really have a whole lot of, let's say, physical strength. So she decides that she's going to poison people. So she climbs a tree to gather some ingredients that she needs. But while she's in the tree, she sees Zaddy Spearmint walk out with a bunch of other people and they're having this meeting under the tree. Oh no. But it's all good because he's just doing some after-school tutoring for a couple of kids because he's trying to earn some extra money for the next time they all go to Hogsmeade. Then we have more school, more wrestling, and Violet keeps winning those wrestling matches because she keeps poisoning her opponent's food. But then it gets to a moment where Violin has to fight Zaddy Spearmint, so they get in the ring and they start going at it. After it's all said and done, she's hotter and wetter than a Texas above-ground pool in mid-July. So now she likes him, but she doesn't want to like him. She wants to like Dane because Dane is a nice guy. But she's also got a thing for bad boys, like every other woman. Dane talks to Violin about something, but then we learn while he's talking that Dane's kind of a wuss. Then all of a sudden it's time to train for the American Ninja Warrior. They call it the Gauntlet, but it's American Ninja Warrior. A girl dies during the training that Violin knew, and apparently it's custom at this school when a student dies, it's the job of the parents to burn all of their belongings. But the parents weren't going to show up for this girl, so Violin decides to burn all of her stuff for them. How sweet. While she's out burning all the stuff, she meets Zaddy Spearmint along the road, and they have this nice little moment. She tells him that she's not really American Ninja Warrior material. She's like, I'm too short, and he's like, no, you totally got this. Some days go by, she trains more, she's getting better, and then finally It's time. And wouldn't you know it, she wins American Ninja Warrior. And then we get to what they call Presentation Day, which essentially is where you peacock walk down this road in front of dragons. So they're peacocking in front of all these dragons, and then one of them decides to burn a student alive. Violin gets felt up by a couple of dragons because apparently dragons don't need consent. Then we get to what's called the threshing, where one of the dragons that you just peacock walked in front of chooses you to bond with, because everyone knows the dragon chooses the wizard. And when a dragon bonds with you, you become its rider and it becomes your dragon. But then Jack Harlow comes in, who's essentially Malfoy in the story, with two friends. So Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle see a small golden dragon and they decide they want to kill it. But Violin steps in and says, hey, no. Violin beats Jack, he runs away, and then a big black dragon comes in and burns Crabbe to death and then tells Violet to kill Goyle, and that's when we find out dragons can talk, but their mouths don't move, so there's no peanut butter necessary. Instead, they just send thoughts down the bond. So the black dragon picks her as his rider, and she flies off on his back, but quickly falls off. But then he saves her, and he's like, what are you doing? Stop falling. And the banter between this dragon and Violin is pretty good in the book. And it turns out not only did she bond with the black dragon, she bonded with the baby golden dragon that Crabbe, Goyle, and Malfoy were trying to kill earlier. Dane the Brain Peeker tells her to choose the weak one so she doesn't have to go to battle, and she's like, I am a strong, independent woman. And then it turns out that the big black dragon, whose name is Tarn, or Tarn, or Turn. I don't know how to pronounce it, and people keep yelling at me online, so I'm just going to call him Tarn. Anyway, so Tarn is apparently Zaddy Spearmint's dragon's mate. Ooh, plot twist. Which also means that Zaddy Spearmint and Violin are all connected mentally, and they can send things down the bond to one another. And then Dane finally kisses her, because they've had these moments here and there, but the book says, hey bro, you're too late. She's craving mint. And we find out that every student gets to have one magical power given to them when they're bonded with a dragon. One of the students finds out that his magical power is reading people's minds, which sounds cool, but unfortunately is super illegal for some reason. He realizes that's his power, he starts freaking out, but luckily a professor comes to his rescue by snapping his neck. Then we get to a moment where Violin is sleeping in the common room, and a bunch of people break in and try to kill her, and that's when we find out that one of Violin's magical powers is that she can put anybody in a game of unconsensual freeze tag. So Zaddy shows up to her rescue while everybody's frozen in place and he kills everybody. Then we learn that the reason she can do a really good game of freeze tag is because baby Goldilocks, which is her other dragon, gave her that power. One of the people that tried to kill her was able to escape, and they think it's this chick named Amber. Turns out it was Amber, so she's brought before a dragon and everybody yells out, Dracarys. Then Violin has this full-blown bodygasm because now she's able to channel from her dragon. But that also means that she's now dragon-level horny. So Violin and Zaddy flirt for a little bit, and he teaches her how to block out dragon thoughts. And then they make out, finally, because it's been way too many frickin' pages, but he stops her because he knows that when you're channeling your dragon, you just want to bump uglies with somebody, and he doesn't want to be known as the guy who took advantage of the drunk chick at the party. Time passes, she keeps winning the wrestling matches, but then it gets to a point where she has to fight Jack Harlow. But she ends up beating him because she nut tags him and feeds him an orange. And then they're told to go on a Dragon Warts scavenger hunt. So they win the scavenger hunt, and their prize is that they get to go look at war or something. While she's looking at war, she gets to see her sister again. And then the griffins attack. Violin wants to stay for her sister, and the whole time I'm thinking, dude, you can't even stay on your own dragon. How are you going to do anything for your sister? So they go back to Dragon Warts. Her sister survives. There's a lot more flirting going on. Karen the magic dragon shows up with a special made saddle that will allow Violin to stay on his back. Then they all go play Dragon Quidditch. But in reality, it's more like the first task of the Tri-Wizard tournament. Jack Harlow shows up and says, what's poppin'? And stabs this guy named Liam. Violin sees Liam get stabbed and turns on the freeze tag magical powers and catches him as he's falling off his dragon and takes him to safety. And then she kills Jack Harlow with lightning, because apparently lightning is her other magical power. And then chapter 30 comes. Zaddy and Violin smash. And we learn that the author is very concerned with an arm war. They all go to some celebration with the king and Violin's mom, but Zaddy's not there, so Violin goes to look for him, and he's hanging out on the middle of the tightrope. They go smash in a dorm room somewhere and break a window. Then they're interrupted by someone who says, hey, we're under attack. They all go outside, and it turns out they're not actually being invaded. They're just doing something called the War Games, which essentially is akin to somebody pulling the fire alarm at a high school. And then Violin goes with Zaddy to the War Game thing, and Dane gets upset because he's Dane. We get there, some Griffin Riders show up, and it turns out that Zaddy's spearmint has been working with the enemy the whole freaking time. So she gets angry and jumps to conclusions. Of course. Then Zaddy tells Violin, hey, there's actually an evil power out here in the world called Venin, and I've been supplying this group of people with equipment to help fight that. They're not the enemy. Then she's like, I don't love you anymore. And he's like, yeah, you do. Shut up. And then we find out that Dane, wanting to live up to his nickname, took a peek in Violin's brain before she left to go to the War Games. Then they have this letter sent to them by somebody, and they're forced to either choose between going to the War Games or saving a city of people. So they decide to help the city, but with the Venin, there's also Wyvern, or whatever it's freaking called, which is essentially like White Walkers and ghosts and dragons. Just picture something evil, that's what it was. They have a war against the vague enemies, and then Liam's dragon dies, which of course means that now Liam's gonna die, and then he dies. And then Zaddy looks at Violin and says, hey, I'm gonna cause a distraction, you go. So he jumps on top of a trailer house and starts shredding to Metallica as the winged enemies come in. And then Violin beats all the creatures, but is unfortunately poison stabbed. She wakes up in this city that's being rebuilt, that's important to the plot if you read the book, and then her dead brother walks in the room. Long story short, I like this book. It's not the greatest writing, and it's got a lot of flaws, but the story's great, and the cliffhanger had me wanting more, so I'm going to give it 4 dragons. Stay tuned for Iron Flame.